What happens when a poised black woman is quietly removed from first class on a plane her husband owns? Camille Harris didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She didn't need to. Just one calm message from seat 14C, and the walls started to shake on the ground and in the air. By the time they landed, the flight attendant who had judged her based on appearance was facing a reckoning far greater than she could have imagined. Stay with us. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell because stories like this are far from over. Camille Harris stepped through the jet bridge of Gate A17 with the kind of composure that made people turn their heads without realizing why. The morning light from the terminal windows followed her like a spotlight, casting soft gold against the dark navy of her tailored wrap dress. Her heels clicked softly on the floor, not too fast, not too loud, just enough to echo her presence. A flight attendant near the entrance gave a perfunctory welcome, but her voice faltered momentarily as Camille approached. There was something magnetic about her, a calm elegance that didn't ask for attention but claimed it anyway. She was a black woman in her early 30s, radiant, refined, and deeply self-possessed. Her hair coiled in neat, defined curls, framed a face that held warmth behind carefully drawn strength. She handed over her boarding pass with a quiet, "Good morning," then moved down the narrow aisle of the Liberty Air flight, her leather tote tucked neatly beneath one arm. First class was already half full. A few passengers sipped coffee or scrolled through devices. Still a few paused to glance up as Camille approached. There was no arrogance in her posture, just confidence, earned and deeply embedded. Camille Harris was no stranger to premium cabins. As the creative director for a major design agency based in San Francisco, her work had graced the pages of Forbes' Architectural Digest, and even a few fashion campaigns she'd never talk about publicly. She'd built her name on vision and grit. But beyond her own success, her husband Noah Harris was a name whispered in tech boardrooms across Silicon Valley. Founder of a multi-billion-dollar enterprise and, though few knew it, majority owner of the very airline she was flying on today. But Camille had never been one to drop names, especially not her husband's. She believed in her own standing. As she reached row 2A, she stowed her tote in the overhead bin with graceful precision. Her seat was by the window. As she settled in, she gave a courteous nod to the older gentleman seated in 2B, then unfolded the soft Liberty Air blanket onto her lap. The hum of boarding announcements echoed faintly from the galley. A baby cried 2 rows behind. The scent of fresh brewed coffee lingered in the air. Everything about the cabin was polished, efficient, curated for comfort. And then came Rebecca Sloan. The lead flight attendant, blonde with a sleek bun and crisp posture, stepped into the aisle with the kind of routine energy that comes from years of experience. She was scanning rows and performing the practiced choreography of boarding prep when she saw Camille. Her eyes hesitated just for a breath. Not enough for most to notice, but it happened. Rebecca's lips parted into a smile, but her eyes didn't quite match it. She gave a brief nod and walked past slowly, her gaze flicking back once as if to verify something unspoken. Her polished professionalism didn't break, but a tiny crease had formed between her brows. Camille felt it, though she didn't look up. She always knew when she was being watched, especially in places where her presence raised questions no one voiced aloud. She exhaled gently and leaned her head back against the plush leather. Outside the window, the tarmac shimmered in the early Atlanta sun. Another business flight, another cabin to sit through with grace. But something about today already felt different, and Camille, without showing it, had learned long ago to stay alert when that feeling settled in Rebecca. Sloan returned to the front of the first-class cabin with a polite efficiency that masked something else entirely. Her steps were measured, her uniform immaculate, her smile perfectly framed, but it still didn't quite reach her eyes. Not when she stopped by seat 2A again. Camille looked up, sensing the shadow before the words. "Excuse me, ma'am." Rebecca began, her tone sugary smooth, but laced with something cooler beneath. "I just need to verify your boarding pass again. There might have been a seating misalignment." Camille blinked once slowly. "Certainly," she replied, reaching into the side of her tote and pulling out the printed boarding pass with the kind of grace that came not just from habit but control. Rebecca took it and gave it only a cursory glance before her eyes flicked back to Camille. The seat number was clear, 2A, first class confirmed. But Rebecca didn't hand it back immediately. "There's just some inconsistency in the system," she added, as if needing to justify her presence. "Sometimes bookings transfer wrong. I'll double-check with the ground crew." Camille's voice stayed even. "Of course, but that is my assigned seat." and I've flown this airline more times than I can count. Rebecca nodded, still holding the paper between her fingers, a beat too long before finally returning it. Thank you for your patience, she offered with a smile that never quite warmed. Then she turned on her heel and walked briskly toward the galley where another younger attendant was organizing beverage trays. Camille watched as the two women leaned into a brief exchange. It was hushed, but the body language said more than words could. Rebecca gestured slightly toward Camille's row, and the younger attendant, shorter brunette no older than 25, cast a quick, curious glance toward seat 2A before returning her attention to her task. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Camille leaned back into her seat, fingers resting lightly on the armrest. The first ripple had passed. The familiar shift had begun. The room, or rather the cabin, didn't speak it aloud, but it had adjusted, that invisible pause. That subtle recalibration of tone, posture, scrutiny? She knew it well. A man 2 rows up cleared his throat. Another passenger stood to place a briefcase in the overhead bin. Around her, the choreography of boarding continued, but the air had changed, slightly colder now, tighter. Camille folded her boarding pass and tucked it back into her bag. She didn't sigh, she didn't flinch, but behind her stillness, she felt the murmur beginning not in voices but in atmosphere, in the way some eyes drifted her way with that familiar sideways curiosity, as if her presence required double-checking, as if her elegance, her ease, her skin didn't quite compute in the logic of this space. Rebecca, meanwhile, had slipped behind the galley curtain, headset pressed to one ear. Yes, she said, her voice a shade tenser now. Passenger in 2A. Just want to confirm she's supposed to be in that seat. I know the manifest says so, but, well, I'd appreciate someone verifying it from the gate records. Camille couldn't hear her, but she could feel her. She always could. The hum of the engines outside had started to rise. The captain's voice came over the PA with a cheerful update about departure times and expected arrival. Camille didn't respond. She sat perfectly composed, eyes fixed on the seat ahead. Something was happening. Not loud, not obvious, but real. And she had no intention of letting it go unnoticed. Rebecca Sloan pressed her fingers into her earpiece, eyes narrowing as she waited for the voice on the other end to return. The call from the gate agent was taking longer than usual. Her gaze drifted back toward the first-class cabin toward seat 2A, still occupied, still composed, still inconvenient. Finally, the voice crackled through Rebecca. We triple-checked. That seat was purchased more than 2 weeks ago, paid in full. No errors in the system. Passenger's name matches. All clean. Rebecca paused, lips tightening. Right. Thanks, she replied. Her voice clipped. She lowered her hand and stared for a moment at nothing, as if trying to make numbers lie. Still, something about that woman didn't sit right. Not her demeanor too calm, not her presence too polished. But it wasn't that. Not really. It was how out of place it all felt to Rebecca's eyes, as if Camille Harris's very confidence was a kind of offense. She turned on her heel and re-entered the cabin, every step a little stiffer than before. Camille saw her coming. Rebecca stopped by 2A, offered a smile that carried none of the usual warmth, and leaned in just enough for the exchange to be heard only by Camille, and perhaps 1 or 2 nearby passengers straining to eavesdrop. Ms. Harris, she began, voice syrupy, sweet, but brittle. I appreciate your cooperation earlier, but I'd like to ask you to step to the rear of the cabin, just for a moment. There's still a small discrepancy with our records. I need to clarify with you directly. Camille tilted her head slightly, studying the woman's expression. Her eyes didn't flicker with uncertainty. She simply reached down, retrieved her tote bag, and stood slowly. Of course, she said, voice steady. Happy to clear it up. Her grace was disarming. She didn't argue, didn't protest, but there was a precision to the way she moved that spoke volumes. A woman used to being underestimated and skilled in choosing her moments. As she stepped into the aisle, her hand slipped into her tote. Her fingers moved across the surface of her phone screen, shielded from view. A few quick taps, then the device disappeared back into the leather folds as she followed Rebecca down the aisle. They passed the curtain into coach, then turned into the narrow galley at the rear of the plane. None of it escaped the watchful eyes of Melanie Torres. The junior flight attendant had been arranging service trays when she caught the exchange. Her brow furrowed as she noticed the way Rebecca's body blocked Camille from view. The stiffness in Rebecca's shoulders, the odd insistence on re-verifying something that had already been cleared. Melanie had seen passengers pulled aside before drunk, disruptive, mistaken seat assignments, but none of those applied here. She didn't know Camille Harris, but she could tell in one glance that this wasn't about tickets or paperwork. It was something else. Rebecca's voice was low now, almost rehearsed. We just want to be absolutely sure. Ms. Harris, I'm sure you understand. We have procedures. Camille didn't raise her voice. She didn't even raise an eyebrow. I do understand procedures, she said calmly. And I also understand when I'm being profiled. So please let's be very clear. I'm cooperating, but I'm also documenting. Melanie's hand faltered on a cup. She glanced toward the rear curtain, unsure if she should step in, unsure if she was even allowed to. The galley suddenly felt too small, too tight with unsaid things, and Camille, who had never needed to raise her voice to command a room, waited quietly poised, alert, and no longer alone in her knowing. The announcement came not with formality, but with a tight-lipped smile and a clipped tone. We'll just have you stay here in the main cabin for now, Ms. Harris. Until the issue is fully resolved. Rebecca Sloane stood rigid beside Camille in the rear galley, her voice laced with false reassurance. She gestured casually toward the row of tightly packed economy seats, as if it were a minor inconvenience, as if the woman before her hadn't just been publicly displaced without cause. Camille blinked once, slowly. Of course, she said, not because she believed this was right, but because she knew when the storm would be more powerful after the silence, with the grace of someone far too accustomed to being underestimated. Camille moved through the cabin once more this time, not as a passenger returning to her rightful place in first class, but as a woman quietly forced into a seat not meant for her. Eyes followed her. Some passengers tried to hide their curiosity behind books or headphones. Others didn't bother. A few whispered with discomfort. The older man in 3C leaned toward his wife. That's the same woman they pulled from first, isn't it? I saw her ticket. The woman replied softly. Said 2A, clear as day. In seat 7B, a college-aged girl with a septum piercing muttered under her breath, This is bull. Just loud enough for her friend beside her to nod in agreement. Camille lowered herself into the cramped middle seat in row 17 without so much as a flinch, her navy dress pressed against the two narrow armrests, her knees grazing the tray in front of her. The contrast between this seat and the plush space she'd paid for had earned was almost laughable. She crossed her legs slowly, delicately adjusting the strap of her tote. From the corner of her eye, she saw Rebecca stride back up the aisle, head high, gaze forward, deliberately avoiding Camille's line of sight. She didn't look back, but Melanie Torres did. From her position near the emergency exit, Melanie watched the entire scene unfold, watched how Camille moved without protest, watched how the passengers reacted, watched how Rebecca said nothing to the woman she'd just humiliated. It wasn't right. Melanie knew it wasn't right. Still, she said nothing. Protocol bound her, rank silenced her. But inside, something had shifted. Camille stared ahead, eyes on the dull fabric of the seat in front of her, her posture straight, despite the constraints of the space. She let her breathing slow. Inhale, hold, exhale. Her mind, however, churned like an engine readying for lift. This wasn't new. It wasn't even surprising, but it was going to be addressed. Her fingers slipped into her bag again, not for her phone this time, but for the smooth leather notebook she always carried. She flipped it open to a fresh page and wrote only one sentence. Document everything. The letters were clean, sharp etched with focus. Across the cabin, murmurs still lingered. Passengers who saw the injustice but weren't sure if they'd imagined it. A few looked at Camille again, as if now seeing her differently. Less an accessory to the cabin's decor, and more a symbol of something quietly broken. She didn't return their stares. She didn't need to. Her dignity sat beside her like a shield, and the fuse that had been lit silently, methodically, was now burning toward its inevitable reckoning. The air in the cabin had shifted. It wasn't just about the tight seats or the recycled air anymore. It was something else. Something heavier, unspoken, yet present. A current running beneath every glance, every murmur. Camille sat still in seat 17B, spine-straight, hands calmly folded in her lap, but she felt it. Felt the eyes pressing against her back like silent accusations or hesitant support. She wasn't sure which. 2 rows ahead, an older woman leaned toward a man who appeared to be her husband. She didn't make a fuss. She whispered, "Why would they move someone like that?" He shook his head. "You saw her. Quiet, graceful. That wasn't someone causing a problem." Near the front of the cabin, a man in business attire, still settling into his first-class seat, reached out and touched Rebecca's arm as she walked by. "Excuse me," he said, voice low but firm. "That woman, the one you moved. She was sitting here earlier, wasn't she?" Rebecca's mouth tightened. "Yes, sir. She seemed perfectly courteous to me. Was there an issue?" Rebecca hesitated just long enough to reveal a crack in her confidence. "There was a discrepancy," she said carefully. "It's being handled." The man narrowed his eyes. Didn't look like a discrepancy. Looked like a decision. Rebecca didn't reply. She gave a tight nod and walked away quickly, almost too quickly. At the back of the galley, Melanie Torres stood waiting, arms crossed, her voice barely a whisper when Rebecca joined her. "You didn't check the manifest again before moving her," Melanie said quietly. "Did you?" Rebecca's jaw clenched. "I followed protocol." "Did you?" Melanie pressed. Rebecca turned eyes sharp. "I didn't feel like she belonged in that seat. That's not a crime." Melanie looked at her for a long beat. "It's not protocol either." The tension between them simmered unspoken but unmistakable. Rebecca turned away without another word, pretending to check supplies, but her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted a stack of paper cups. Back in economy. Camille's phone vibrated softly in her lap. She glanced down the screen, lighting up with a message handled "Sit tight." There was no signature, but she didn't need one. Her lips pressed together into a barely there smile, not smug, not spiteful, just assured. She leaned back slightly in the uncomfortable seat, her fingers resting once again on the leather spine of her notebook. Around her, the whispers grew. She was in first class. I saw her. Maybe it was a mix-up. No, that wasn't a mix-up. From across the aisle, a teenage girl in a hoodie looked over at Camille, her brows furrowed. "You okay, ma'am?" she asked softly. Camille turned, her expression calm and composed. "Yes. Thank you." The girl nodded, but the concern in her eyes lingered. Camille returned to stillness, but inside her the gears were turning. The message had been sent, and the moment for quiet observation was coming to a close. She was no longer alone in this. That much was clear. And Rebecca Sloan was no longer in control. The cockpit phone buzzed softly, its light blinking a steady amber. Rebecca Sloan paused mid-step in the galley, glancing toward it with mild annoyance. She picked up the receiver, brushing a strand of blonde hair behind her ear. "Rebecca here." The captain's voice was calm but clipped. "Need you to verify something. Passenger profile Camille Harris. Seat 2A transferred to economy, corporate flagged it. Recheck her file." Rebecca's heart gave a small jolt. "Why?" There was a pause. Then more firmly, "Just do it." She swallowed hard. "Copy that." She hung up the phone, settling into its cradle with a dull click. For a moment, Rebecca stood motionless, the buzz of the cabin fading around her. Why would corporate flag someone? Her fingers moved quickly over the small tablet affixed to the galley wall. A few swipes of code, and then there it was. Passenger name, Camille Harris. Booking class first. Verified account. Status platinum. Executive. Additional notes. Authorized priority status. Emergency contact. Noah Harris. Noah Harris, founder and CEO, Aerolux Airlines. Rebecca stared at the screen, and the color drained from her face. She read the line again, slower this time, as if the words would rearrange themselves into something less catastrophic. But there it was. Noah Harris. The man whose name was etched across every corporate boardroom who helmed the very airline she worked for was Camille Harris's husband. Her fingers hovered in the air, the screen still glowing in front of her. The world around her felt suddenly muffled like sound underwater. Melanie Torres stepped into the galley behind her and noticed the frozen look on her face. "What's going on?" she asked. Rebecca didn't move. Melanie leaned forward slightly, peering over her shoulder. Her eyes widened. "Oh my God," she whispered. "You didn't know who she was, did you?" Rebecca turned slowly. Her mouth opened, then closed again. She looked like someone caught in a storm she never saw coming. "I thought she was just..." She started, but the sentence dissolved before it finished. "Just what?" Melanie asked, her voice a mix of disbelief and restrained anger. "Just another black woman sitting in a seat you didn't think she earned." Rebecca's lips parted to defend herself, but no words came. There was no good answer, no excuse that wouldn't sound worse when spoken aloud. She turned back to the screen, staring at the name again as if sheer willpower could erase it. Camille Harris. Camille Harris. Married to the man who signs their paychecks. Rebecca's throat felt dry. Her hands moved mechanically now, exiting the passenger file, locking the screen. She turned and reached for a plastic cup of water, but even that seemed to slip slightly in her grasp. Melanie didn't say anything else. She simply stared at her superior, her expression unreadable but her disappointment unmistakable. Rebecca finally spoke, her voice hoarse. "I need to fix this." Melanie didn't answer. Her silence was more condemning than any words she could have chosen. Rebecca braced her hands against the galley counter, breathing slowly, deliberately. She had just humiliated the wife of the man who owned the sky she was flying in, and now the altitude wasn't what was making her dizzy. Rebecca Sloan stood at the front of the economy cabin, her hands nervously clasped behind her back. She had rehearsed her lines in the galley, hoping to mask the tremor in her voice, but as she stepped into the narrow aisle, all pretense of confidence began to fray. Camille Harris sat upright in her cramped middle seat, flanked by two strangers who had offered awkward smiles when she arrived earlier. The contrast between her composed posture and the seat's rigid discomfort was striking. She exuded elegance even here. Rebecca approached slowly. "Mrs. Harris," she said, her voice soft, strained. I want to sincerely apologize. There was clearly a mistake, and I deeply regret how it was handled. Your original seat is still available, and I'd like to escort you back now." Camille turned her head with quiet deliberation. Her gaze was steady, unflinching. The cabin around them had fallen nearly silent. "I appreciate your apology," she said evenly, "but we'll stay where we are." Rebecca blinked. "Mrs. Harris, please." "You're more than welcome," I said. Camille repeated gently. "We'll stay here." She looked past Rebecca, not waiting for a reply, and retrieved her phone from the seat pocket. Her fingers moved swiftly, typing a short message before locking the screen again, with finality. The message had gone to Valerie Cray, her husband's chief of staff. Handled. Please loop in legal. Quiet for now. At the front of the plane, the captain's phone rang. He answered with a practiced calm, but his eyes narrowed within seconds. He motioned to the CO pilot and pressed the receiver closer. "Yes, sir," confirmed. "We're addressing it immediately." He hung up without fanfare, but with a new stiffness in his posture. Back in the cabin, murmurs were growing louder. A businessman 2 rows ahead leaned to his seatmate. "That's her. The one they made move." Another passenger, a woman in her 60s, didn't bother whispering. "I saw the way that attendant talked to her. She didn't do anything wrong." The murmurs snowballed. A college-aged girl stood up in her row, glancing back toward Camille. "Excuse me," she called out to Rebecca. "Are you going to explain why she was moved? Because it sure didn't look like policy." Rebecca's mouth opened, then shut. She was cornered, mid-air, mid-mistake, no exit. Melanie Torres, standing in the aisle behind her, finally spoke up. "She did everything by the book." Melanie said, motioning toward Camille. She had her seat. She was calm, professional. What happened wasn't protocol. Rebecca whipped her head around, eyes wide. "Melanie." But Melanie didn't back down. "It's the truth." Camille's gaze flicked to the younger flight attendant. There was a flicker of gratitude, subtle but unmistakable. The cabin seemed to tilt with the weight of collective awareness. Truth had cracked the silence open, and now passengers were leaning in, listening, watching, judging. Rebecca took a step back, retreating toward the galley. Without another word, Camille returned to her silence. Her husband would already know. The next steps were inevitable. And as the plane cruised high above the clouds, the ripple of consequences had already begun its descent. The wheels touched down with a soft thud against the tarmac, but the energy inside the cabin was anything but soft. A ripple of tension swept through the rows like an unspoken warning. The usual hum of passengers unbuckling seatbelts and checking phones was drowned in the weight of what everyone now understood: something serious had happened on this flight, and it wasn't over yet. Camille Harris sat still in her cramped seat, the same calm grace she had maintained since being relocated, radiating from her posture. She didn't rush. She didn't flinch. She simply waited, her eyes fixed forward as if her spirit had already stepped off the plane ahead of her body. At the front of the aircraft, Rebecca Sloan stood stiffly near the galley, pale and motionless, her hands clasped so tightly behind her back they trembled. She had received the captain's final transmission minutes earlier. "Remain on board. Company representatives will meet you at the gate." The words hadn't needed elaboration. Rebecca had felt her world shifting from the moment she'd heard who Camille was. Each passing minute since had only tightened the noose around her pride, her confidence, her career. As the cabin door finally opened, the sun spilled into the front of the plane, but what truly turned heads were the figures waiting outside. 3 sharply dressed airline executives stood at the jet bridge, flanked by 2 uniformed airport officers, and worse still, a local news crew with cameras already rolling. Camille rose from her seat slowly. Passengers around her parted instinctively, some with quiet nods of respect, others with shame on their faces. Melanie Torres, the junior flight attendant, lingered halfway up the aisle, watching every movement with anxious eyes. Camille reached for her carry-on, smoothed the front of her dress, and stepped forward with the quiet poise of someone who had endured worse and emerged stronger. The moment she crossed the threshold into the jet bridge, the nearest executive approached with an outstretched hand. "Mrs. Harris, we are deeply sorry for what you experienced today. We'd like to." Camille offered a short but graceful smile. "You'll be hearing from my husband's legal office. Until then, I'd prefer not to speak on the matter." Without another word, she continued, walking past them, the cameras capturing every confident step as the world around her scrambled to keep up. Back inside the aircraft, Rebecca was asked to remain in the jump seat by order of company operations. Her attempts to speak were dismissed with a flat, rehearsed line from the captain. "Internal affairs will meet you shortly." It wasn't long before 2 airline investigators boarded the plane. One of them, a woman in her 40s with a clipboard and no trace of warmth, nodded toward Melanie. "We'd like a statement from you, please. Privately." Melanie hesitated only a moment before stepping forward. She knew the truth mattered more than the job she was trying to protect. "I'll tell you everything I saw," she said, "and I'll stand by it." In that moment, the divide between silence and courage closed. The company would soon be forced to confront more than just a disgraced flight. A culture would be placed under the microscope. Outside, Camille entered a black SUV waiting curbside, where her husband's chief of staff sat in the passenger seat with a tablet already open. Camille didn't look back at the plane. She didn't need to. The storm had already landed. By sunrise the next morning, the fallout had begun. Rebecca Sloan sat alone in a stark white conference room on the lower floor of the Aerolux Airlines Operations Center. Her badge had already been turned and her access revoked. An HR representative and a compliance officer sat across from her, silent as they flipped through typed reports, printed emails, and a transcript of Melanie Torres's statement. They weren't here to ask more questions. The decision had already been made. "We're placing you on indefinite suspension, pending the outcome of a full investigation," the HR officer said coldly. "You are not to represent the airline in any capacity, nor communicate with passengers or personnel until further notice." Rebecca nodded stiffly. Her face, drained of color, held the weary expression of someone watching the scaffolding of their career collapse. She didn't speak. There was nothing left to defend. By midday, internal memos had swept across the company's intranet. Department heads received urgent directives: reevaluate first-class service protocols, re-examine implicit bias training modules, and conduct emergency reviews of customer interaction policies. In the marketing wing, public relations teams scrambled to draft a statement that wouldn't sound like damage control, even though it clearly was. Meanwhile, across the country in San Francisco, Camille Harris stood beside her husband, Noah. Harris at a podium inside a glass-paneled conference hall. Cameras clicked and microphones hummed as reporters leaned forward. Noah, co-founder and CEO of Harris Tech and majority shareholder of Aerolux Airlines, addressed the nation with calm clarity. "What happened to my wife is not just about seating or airline policy," he said. "It's about dignity. It's about the insidious nature of bias, how it hides behind protocol and procedure." He paused, his gaze sharp behind rimless glasses. "Respect must never be optional." The room fell silent before the flurry of questions began. But Camille stayed silent, standing at her husband's side, chin held high. She didn't need to speak. Not yet. The world had heard enough from her presence alone. Later that evening, back in the quiet of their home overlooking the San Francisco Bay, Camille sat near the window, reflecting not on the flight, but on the woman she used to be. She thought of her early days, long before magazine spreads and gallery openings, long before she became the name behind award-winning ad campaigns. There were years of being underestimated, being passed over in meetings, being mistaken for the assistant when she was the creative director. She had learned to stay composed when people mispronounced her name, learned to keep a steel spine when others tested her limits. But she had also learned that silence could be its own form of resistance. Camille had fought to be seen and heard, not just for herself, but for the young women who looked like her. And now, standing at the center of a national conversation, she knew this moment was bigger than an apology or policy memo. This was a fire, and she intended to use it to illuminate what so many had ignored for too long. She picked up her phone, drafted a message to her personal communications team. Start compiling data on complaints from marginalized passengers. Let's build something bigger. As she hit send, Camille knew this wasn't just fallout, it was foundation. The boardroom was quieter than usual. Aerolux Airlines had summoned its top executives, directors, and stakeholders to a closed-door meeting on the 32nd floor of their San Francisco headquarters. Floor-to-ceiling windows flooded the room with morning light, but the atmosphere was heavy. Chairs shifted, pens tapped. No one dared speak first. Then the door opened. Camille Harris entered with deliberate grace, her navy suit crisp, her heels silent on the marble floor. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. Her presence spoke louder than any words ever could. With calm poise, she took the seat reserved at the head of the table, one usually meant for people who never got moved to economy. The chairman cleared his throat. "Mrs. Harris, thank you for joining us." Camille gave a slight nod. "Let's begin." For the next hour, a new chapter unfolded. The airline announced sweeping reforms, mandatory bias and cultural sensitivity training for all staff, flight and ground alike. A full audit of seating protocols. A restructuring of the leadership team, starting with an internal ethics officer reporting directly to the board. And at Camille's urging, a new committee would be formed, one dedicated to passenger equity and dignity, co-chaired by an external advisory council. The final announcement came with no theatrics. Rebecca Sloan had resigned, effective immediately. Internal reviews cited failure to uphold the airline's standards of equitable treatment. No further details were offered. None were needed. As Camille left the boardroom that afternoon, her phone buzzed in her hand. A headline blazed across the screen. "Black woman, demoted to economy. Turns out, she's married to the owner." It had begun. By evening, the story was everywhere. News outlets covered it coast to coast. Op-eds poured in. Comment sections filled with praise and outrage. Clips of Noah Harris's speech and stills of Camille walking through the gate trended across platforms. But the photo that went most viral was simple. Camille exiting the terminal, head held high, flanked by no one. Her silhouette framed by sunlight, unbothered, unbent, unforgettable. In the days that followed, invitations flooded in. Podcasts, panels, newsrooms. Camille declined them all. She had said what she needed to say, and it was already echoing louder than she ever imagined. Back at home, she sat on her patio overlooking the bay, legs crossed, a cup of tea balanced in her hand. Melanie Torres had sent a thank you note handwritten along with a quiet update. She had accepted a promotion to work with the ethics committee. Camille had helped create. Camille smiled softly, eyes resting on the horizon. She thought of the phrase she had heard 1,000 times before, spoken with smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes. "Are you sure you belong here?" And now she finally had the answer. Not with anger, not with defiance, but with something far stronger. Yes, she belonged. She always had. And now the world knew it too. If this story moved you, please like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful stories like this. This was never just about a seat on a plane. It was about what happens when quiet strength meets loud injustice, and proves that dignity doesn't need to shout to change the world. It reminds us that racial bias still exists, not just in courtrooms or street corners, but in boardrooms, airports, and first-class cabins. In our personal lives, we must confront bias when we see it. In the workplace, we must train better, lead better, and listen deeper. As a community, we must protect those who are silenced or judged before they ever speak. Because when we practice humility, fairness, and respect, we create a world where no one has to prove they belong, they just do.